Dear colleagues, welcome to the School of Architecture here at UT Austin. Welcome to the second day of the 6th Latitudes Conference. We're all looking forward to the second day of presentations. Why this conference type? The idea of this conference was generated over 7 years ago as a way to understand contemporary architectural practice in a larger notion of what is America. In common international parlance, the word America is synonymous with the United States of America. However, anyone traveling beyond the borders of the United States of America and within the double continent of America will sooner or later have come across with greater or lesser subtlety a certain kind of resistance from natives of the visited countries to the embracing sense of America as solely synonymous with the USA. Not to speak of other subtle tests of people's conception of which countries belong to which part of these double continents. Can you quickly name the countries of the North American half of the Americas? Mexico is normally left out. So what is America and what constitutes this double continent in cultural and architectural terms? In requesting that the speakers primarily focus on one building, we not only want to know more about the client, the climate, the lighting, the site, the design, the constructional details and the materials, we also want to know about the why and the how. Why is the design the way that it is? And how have the architect's thoughts and the identified conditions generated the design the way that it is? And how, in these moments of reflection and synthesis, has the architect transformed the raw elements into this magic composition of space and form? When Michael Benedict, Kevin Alter, Barbara Hoyden and Vince Snyder and I began thinking about this format 7 years ago, the world around us was barely holding together. Dark clouds were forming on the horizon. It wasn't the usual tornadoes that were sweeping across the Great Plains at the end of 2008. It was the collapse of Lehman Brothers that shook the world, that caused the financial debacle from which the world has not as yet recovered, and which is being met with the same voodoo economics as had been administered decades before the Lehman Brothers crash. We are, to be frank, in a worse financial situation than we were in 2006 or 2008. Mark my words. And yet, when we embarked on this conference format with its first edition in the spring of 2009, we were all very hopeful that the crisis would soon subside. Parallel to the global property bubble which led to this crisis, parallel to the worldwide spread of suburbia, parallel to the diffusion of the Athens Charter modernist and now North American model of urbanism, with its speculative development and its functional segregation, there was for a few decades the focus on the need to rein in this excess. The call in 1972 by the Club of Rome to the end of conventional growth models has unfortunately landed on deaf ears. Sustainability has been reduced to counting a few points on the way to collecting tranquilizing metal-colored certificates: silver, gold, platinum. Sustainability has not had a fundamental impact on the rate and quality of production of architecture. Similarly, the subject of social inequality or that of emergency settlements. As yesterday's discussion showed, we should have the clarity of thought and methodology to criticize architectural production with and not despite their conditions of gestation. Can an architecture for victims of civil war or natural disaster permanently transform people's lives? Or are these shelters by definition temporary? Should we judge them from this perspective only? Or as in the case of Alborda's School for the Coastal Village, should we assess the design of the building independently of the conditions that brought it about? The answer is, of course we can isolate the objects and judge them on their own merits, but it would rob them of their meaning. Their meaning that they have attained as a result of the thought and production that the collective has invested in them. Their meaning that they attain in the wider international context of architectural production of buildings of a similar kind. I mentioned the Lehman Brothers collapse, sustainability and climate change, and social inequality. Architecture is part of this system. Let's not pretend that buildings can be constructed in splendid isolation as self-sufficient symbols of an architecture for architects. We know that this has been the dominant paradigm of the last decades. It has generated the Zumthors, the saunas, and the pianos. But architecture is more. It can do more. It can transform the fate of individuals and of entire societies. It has proven that it could do this over the course of the last century, however, in my view, unfortunately in the wrong direction, numbing suburbans and vain urbanites. Architecture has the power to lead by example, building by building. From the specific solution to a given context that by abstraction and translation can find application on a general international level. These Latitudes conferences then are thus a small contribution towards a search for new seeds, alternative paradigms, better and more appropriate practices for a world that has not as yet found answers to the financial crisis, to climate change, and to social inequality. Architecture is because of its context. The client, the users, the site, the climate, the region, the culture, the society, the issues, and the world at large. No man is an island. No piece of architecture exists on its own, even if it looks like an independent volume on a greenfield site. Every piece of architecture, every design contribution for the environment is part of the rest of the world. Let us engage and contribute towards the transformation of the world in a critical way. And now I call on my colleague to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Elias Montemayor. I am an assistant professor of landscape architecture here at the school. I am one of the new faculty members, and I am also Mexican, like Fernanda. And that is also part of the reason why I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present here, but it's just part of the reason. Fernanda Canales studied architecture at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, graduating in 1997. She holds a master's degree in architecture from the Universidad Politécnica de Catalunya, from Barcelona, and a PhD from the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura in Madrid. Fernanda's work is both admirable and exemplary. She's not only an educator and a successful practitioner with widely published projects and buildings, some of which she will present today, but probably most importantly as well, she's also, as demonstrated by her publications, one of the most important architectural curators and historians of Mexican modern architecture, Mexican architecture of the 20th and 21st century. Her work is exemplary as well because she not only publishes her research in architecture and design journals and magazines, but also publishes in general audience magazines, venues, newspapers. Among these, El País, magazines such as Letras Libres, which are venues which are not predominantly focused on architecture, but in general culture. She also, she's one of the key actors that explain the growth of architectural publications and architectural culture in Mexico and Latin America in recent years and decades. Fernanda has made architecture and urbanism more available to the general public. In her most recent book, which is called Arquitectura en Mexico, Architecture in Mexico, 1900 to 2010. Fernandez speaks about and confirms the amazing growth of architectural publications in Mexico and Latin America, particularly in Mexico in the last few years. I was looking at the timeline that she made on the architectural publications, and I think she's clearly one of the reasons why it has grown in such impressively in the last few years. This book, it's an 8-pound book, 2 volumes. It's an archive of archives, as she presents the work in her foreword. And I don't know if this is an important fact to comment about the book, but just the shipping costs between Mexico City and Austin was $100. I got it. So I think that speaks of the importance and the strength of her scholarly work. I know that Fernandez here most likely going to present her professional practice work, but I really consider that it's very important to present Fernanda also in that very important part of her work, which is the editorial, the publishing work, the scholarly work in Mexican architecture. So please join me on welcoming Fernanda.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this wonderful and generous presentation. And also thank you, obviously, Wilfred Wang. It's a big honor to be here. Thank you, Barbara and Kevin and all of you for being here. And I'm going to speak about a project, a cultural center in Mexico City, finished about a year ago. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to speak about how this project is transforming into a new set of projects. And just before that, a brief introduction, just to try to frame the work that I do, because it ranges, well, as Gabriel said, sometimes in the shape of books, sometimes in research, and other times, as you can see this image, in very small projects, temporary installations, other times in urban design projects or client-based residential projects also. So I will briefly show 5 projects just to work, in order to work as a frame of what I usually work with or what interests me or concerns me about architecture. Working always in Mexico, being places such as Monterrey or Guadalajara, but mainly Mexico City, I engage in competitions. The project you see on the top is a university campus in Monterrey. It was a competition for making a building that had to be finished in 4 months. It had to cost the equivalent of almost a social house, a project per square meter, obviously. And there was always the intention of, or the question of, how can we open up the structures into the complexity of the geographical condition, the social, the political, and basically making different ways of connecting the physical with the social. So on the bottom part, you see a house. It's a typically a program for a house in Mexico City, but it also deals with this intention of opening up architecture, even though you have to respond to I don't know, private conditions and the importance of intimacy, but you're also conditioned by very threatening or chaotic context, and how in that sense you still have the small opportunity of opening up to the views while maintaining an intimate condition. with this relationship always between the public and the private realm. And also a project at the top competition for building 3 big theaters in Guadalajara. We had actually Carlos Jimenez as a jury. And even if it's a closed program like theaters are, the condition or the aim of this project was to build theaters for people who are never going to buy a ticket and will never actually be sitting in a chair seeing a show. So how the importance of the project did not rely on the building itself, but rather fragmenting and opening up the building, despite it had to share all the common services. But how do we think of a space for people who are never invited inside those public buildings? So with different plazas, terraces, and connecting spaces, thinking more about the in-between spaces between closed boxes was part of the, it is part of the actual intention of the project. And sometimes very small works, such as how do you use or reuse abandoned materials from the site, or how do we rethink the way materials are used, in this case the chairs, furniture, that incorporates the local handcraft and labor, and also tradition and history. It's a sort of a reinterpretation of Clara Porcet's work. It was a Mexican-Cuban designer. So how, in different ways, my work is a way of trying to answer the same questions that have to do with the political, the social, and the economical context. And in this project was a work made by different architects, designers, artists. We draw in the central part of the city, the Zócalo, which is an enormous plaza. We wanted to make visible all these different forces that inform our work and that are always disconnected to the actual society. So how to make conscious of that and make people participate. So we began drawing. It was a project that lasted several days. So the first days we just draw the natural conditions of the city, and we draw the different lakes. The blue lines respond to the natural lacustrine condition that has always been neglected. Mexico City stands, as you know, on a lake, but we always have given the back to that natural condition, and we have deserted the lakes. So we still wanted to draw the existing, the last rivers and lakes in the city, but also the political demarcations, the boundaries that divide and fracture the city. It's a city where you even the same house can be halfway standing in the Mexican City district, and the other half of a house or of a street working with the legislations of the Estado de Mexico. So you have different laws, you have different budgets, it's a really strange way, and we thought that making that visible, drawing that, would help us to understand the place in which we work. Also, obviously, the small natural reserve places, but with the possibility of understanding it as a place that can be changed. Not this big monster we don't understand, but sometimes the place where we still can make decisions and we still can be able to affect the way we understand the city. So at the end, it's this big question: how do we as architects understand this very complex territory, this fast-growing place that works, I believe, sometimes in oppositions or contradictory conditions? With these two images, the first one in the left, it's the lack of public space that exists in the city, but also the way people appropriate and make their places their own with these paracaidistas or with marketplaces, improvised architecture, not designed by architects, but it's the natural response for all that we are not actually doing. And also the lacustrine condition, it's a city which has been dried out, but still when you carve, you can find water, and it happened in the cultural center. We found water just 40 centimeters below ground floor. So it's a really strange condition that has been neglected, but every now and then, every time it rains, the city floods, and we receive actually enough rain that if we used it, it would serve to give service to all of the city, but actually we send it all through the drainage to the sewage right away. So we have to import water from, we're drying off all of the regionals across and every time farther and farther away. So then we have this natural ways of reminding us what is going actually on in the city. And I like this image very much because it's, for me, it's the last time, this is in late 1960s, is the last time where the city was actually still a place that you could map, you could decide it, you could make plans ahead. And it's when the Olympic, 1968 Olympic was made. And it's the last time where this territory was still understood as a whole. After that, we have only short-term responses, fractured landscape, a city that we don't even know how much it grows every day. Some people say it's 1 acre a day. Others, like Untergeso said, it's a statistically indeterminate place. So how do we as architects stand on top of this place and try to give answers? So for me, there are two main themes that interest me more and more. I will try to explain them. One has to do with this image, a drawing made by Matthias Geritz in 1952 when he designed the El Eco Museum. And for me, it's a fantastic image because it synthesizes everything that's going on in this space. Matthias Geritz wasn't even an architect. He was an artist exilied to Mexico in the early 40s. And when he did this museum, in this image, I think you can see the patio inside, you can see the objects or the sculptures inside the place. You can also see the outside, the wall, the entrance, the stairs, the second floor, and it intrigues me. How are you able to group or to compose with all these different elements and this fragmented nature of architecture? Something that for me during my years of studies was always impossible, and it still is, to understand or even to represent in a plan, the impossibility of understanding what Josh said yesterday, this magical moment, or the house and the house, and it's for me it's really important to try to understand this abstract view that in a way synthesizes the essence of a project. And at the other opposite of this theme, I wouldn't say the opposite, it's just more like when you take a sock and you turn it around, so it's the inside part of it, which would be the way we actually use spaces inside, the everyday, in Spanish, the espacio de lo cotidiano, when you're actually just sitting in a place and understanding architecture as a window or as a connection with the outside. I think it has to do with the way our bodies or our everyday life exchanges or interacts with the other, with the outside. So now speaking directly with about the cultural center, this was a project, it was a competition organized by the Ministry of Culture, the same ministry that in the past administration had organized this very big international competition to build the José Vasconcelos Library, the project, wonderful building made by Alberto Calach. But it's important to understand that that administration, the strategy was to build one single big building at the capital city, at the central part of the city, with a budget of $100 million, which was actually the whole budget they had to do anything in the government period. And in this case, more than 6 years later, the new administration said, we're going to build not just one big one, but smaller cultural and spaces and libraries. This one specifically would represent less than 2% of the budget, of the size, and of the number of books found in the other one. And despite being also in Coyoacán, which has become a central area, it's a neighborhood that used to be outside the city. It has this strange condition that it's a very touristic place, but less and less people are not living there anymore. There we have weekend houses, enormous houses that are abandoned or that have become clandestine offices because land use has not been redefined. So you have a wonderful place that has lost more than 200,000 people population in the last years, but then it's a very lively and active place for informal commerce and for traffic, but people are not having the services and the spaces they need to actually live there. So the project here takes an abandoned house, this typical large house that didn't have any value architectonically speaking, but it was in a historical center of a place that, for anybody that knows Coyoacán, is really a charming place characterized by very, very big gardens, wonderful trees, but that are always shut off. And what you get as a citizen is just narrow streets, very high walls on your sides, and you never actually can see the trees or can see the wonderful gardens that are inside the spaces that now are usually abandoned. So the project wanted to revert the situation, and we took the existing house. We couldn't touch it, we couldn't change it, but so in a way, this project was born out of a contradiction. For one sense, the windows were too small, dark space, the interior was really dark. It was a typical house with 16 rooms for the 12 children that nobody has anymore. And you couldn't change that, but at the same time, there was the idea of making it really public, exhibiting the inside out to the streets, inviting people, and in a way making visible the public condition and the books that were to be housed inside. So the project consisted of two strategies. The first one, the most important one, was to eliminate the wall and trying to make the sidewalk come inside the project or making the project go out to the streets. And also a third strategy, the second strategy was to build in the back part of the house, and we had new constructions that invaded the plot. So we were proposed to make a volume on the backside with housing all of the services such as parking space, a small auditorium, offices, seminars, areas for seminars, bathrooms, storage. So in a way connecting these two areas, because it had the house was sitting at the middle of the plot. So if we see this image, you can see the existing house at the center, and all of the rest of the space was treated as a residual area. It used to be an office after that, and all the front part, which you had the trees, was converted into parking space. So we wanted to guarantee that the outer space, or the connection between the sidewalk and the green spaces inside of the project were actually almost the same thing, and trying to just broaden the sidewalk and opening up everything to the exterior. So we did a frame at the front of the existing house. It was actually a strange situation because it became a very polemical project. At the beginning, neighbors were really happy, and when they saw that we were taking off this existing wall, they felt really threatened that people would see that they were welcome inside, and that might represent a flow of people that they wouldn't want near. But it was very important for the Minister of Culture. Actually, we worked the project with all of the stages that had to approve the project. It was the local district, it was the federal government, it was the patrimony institution, and she always said, the Minister of Culture said, if the books are not visible from the outside, then the project doesn't work. So there was this attempt to portray this public condition of the building, and that was actually the time where everybody in the local neighborhood felt really threatened that actually you were gonna see that you were invited. In Mexico, well, I think in many places, but people are sometimes frightened that they don't have an ID or they don't have money to buy a ticket. So this was, the idea was to make it visible that you could go inside with no money, no IDs required, and making a library for people who have never read before. A little bit like the theater that was taught for people who were never going to be sitting inside the theater. So in this model, maybe it's clear that the house is sitting at the middle, and then you have a volume at the back of the piece of land, and a big just frame at the front, a triple height public foyer, just to, in a way, frame the existing house and open up at the same time that you bring light inside the space. So here I think it's clear. We also wanted, as well as we wanted to get the books outside, we wanted to take the trees inside. This relationship between the existing vegetation and also appropriating the trees, even in the sidewalk or even in the neighbor's garden besides. And here you see the section on the back of the volume in the back, where you see the small auditorium and office spaces, areas for seminars, and small patios. The whole project has different small patios. There are these openings to provide light inside the space with double heights, with domes. And the idea of not fragmenting the front part, the existing building, and then the program in the back, but actually thinking of it as a fluid space, as just as one project, and connecting the old and the new, connecting the inside and the outside. And here, well, I think we have better detail in these ones. Well, the program, it's a really basic one with this this area, which is the triple height foyer, the entrance, and we wanted to make the connection always through this existing building. We didn't want people just to go to the new part, avoiding the use of the existing house. So we emphasized the use of this area, and you have small patios in the back, small one here in the middle, and play of double heights and domes just to let light in all of the space. And while the basement is for storage and for parking space. You can see also in the sections that the house is sort of constrained between these new structures, but when you see the relationship here in these sections, actually it becomes part of the same space in the inside. And here I think this image represents better what we were trying to make this building connect with the outside. And here's some just images of the process, because it had to take into account all the straight jacket conditions of tight budget, tight schedules, not qualified hand labor. And we're just going to see a 20-second video of the process. We have no sound here, but it's just so you can get the idea of how improvised sometimes the work becomes. And actually, I don't have an office. I work by myself. This work was done in collaboration with Arquitectura 911 and also with landscape designers Hugo and Tonatiu, and also with designers such as Ariel Rojo. And so it's obviously a big team, but I'm mostly always in the construction site, or as Gabriel says, more in writing and researching. But the importance of being in a work in a place such as Mexico, where most of the construction workers do not know how to read, so you are constantly improvising with these tight conditions. And I'm gonna go fast in these images. They're all of the inside spaces where you can see the old house, and then how does it relate with the idea of opening up and making it actually really accessible and visible. These are the lamps designed by Ariel Rojo, who's a young designer. And the connection with the new service block, and also the relevance of trying to maintain the original condition of the existing house. Always framing the outside. It's really chaotic outside. You have marketplaces, you have lots of cars and traffic. So we wanted to make a different sense of silent green space that invited people to come in, even people who were not reading or buying books. And these areas are small places for cafeteria, for having internet access. And so we always take the existing conditions. Sometimes you start finding accidents in the work, and you incorporate the things that we find. Sometimes has to do with history, sometimes it has to do with local materials or different ways of using common materials. And with the aim of providing this tranquility in an actually chaotic context, with the small gardens at the sides. Here you can see a piece by an artist, Paloma Torres, who did an intervention. It's a sort of a door, a bronze door. and with a lot of detail on the hand labor, on an unqualified, fast hand labor, but trying to take care of those different conditions. These are the doors, and the idea also of expressing through materials the importance of the hand labor, the importance of tradition, the importance of artisan work. And these are the two last images of the project. I would now like to speak on the different ideas that are evolving after this project. Now we have a new administration, and if in that time the idea was to work with the 2% of what used to be the budget of the past administration, now we're working on a series of projects that instead of having just one big library costing $100 million, having, say, more than 10,000 very, very small places to read that can be actually changing the life of people, not in a central capital area, but actually reaching more parts of the society. And it has to do, it's a project that has to do with the same client, the Ministry of Culture, but also with the housing institution, the Infonavit, which after having built across the country this terrible housing solutions for decades, now we're facing all of the problems due to this type of urbanism and architecture, and with terms of insecurity, of problems with obviously economical and social conditions. So the project is now situated in this kind of context, and the project was born out of a critique I've been doing about the social conditions of social housing. And here it was a project that I made for an exhibition space. It was made 2 years ago, when we built the size of the room that is being built for thousands and millions of times throughout the country. So we have a social house that has been drawn in the floor. It's 35 square meters. And usually we have more than 5 or 6 people average living in these places, where when you actually draw it in the floor, you can see that if you sit down in the chair, then it's impossible to enter the kitchen or actually to enter the bathroom. Or the size of the room there, I don't know if you can see the mattress. It's a regular size standard individual mattress. You cannot open the door because of the mattress. And we have sometimes 2 or 3 kids, even sometimes the grandmother or cousins living in this room. So making that visible to other parts of society, I think it's part of our job. You can see the size of a person and the size of the room. And by doing that, and also by mapping the actual projects, residential projects that are being constructed, we're trying to make the point of how important it is that we approach these subjects and that we work in these scenarios. And one thing that's happening in all of these housing units that were built by the government is that the parking space has become a useless space. Most of the people don't have cars anyway, and the ones who do have to lock them down. So you have there's all of the appropriation of the spaces, of all the services that weren't provided in these social housing units. And you have these strange situations of spaces that cannot be used in any other way because you have the cages of the cars, so they won't be stolen, but you don't even have many cars. you don't even have cars. So the project is developed with this idea. What do we do with these spaces, abandoned spaces of parking lots that are not being used, with also the scarcity of other services that obviously these social housing units lack. So by doing that and putting together the institution, housing institution, with the Ministry of Culture, and having just the Ministry of Culture give books, donate books, so we can have another use of this small space. Actually, the project measures the same as a car parking space. So it's a prototype that can grow and can be used in different ways. But the basic one, the smallest, measures 250 by 5, which is a parking space. And it has just 4 elements. It's really a cheap and easy to build model that we're beginning to build a couple of them next month. And the idea is that the government pays for the material and then the community builds it, because there's always this rejection for something that's imposed from the outside. So we believe that making the people participate, and it's thought to be, well, you can continue to grow, or you can choose not 1 parking space, but 2. And it's thought to be built with the materials that you can find in whatever store. We call them ferreterias in Mexico. It's like a corner 7-Eleven store, not for buying Cokes, but for buying construction materials, which is just cement, wood, and just celosía, which is this over here, but it's just concrete block that it's put the other way around, so you can have cross ventilation and you can have a safe place, because it's always visible from the outside. You can always see what's happening inside. And there are different forms of grouping these units. If it works out, the idea is that you can have different qualities of spaces and different situations going, sometimes using it to read, sometimes using it for computers or for even social activities. There's also one prototype considering an extension in the 2nd floor, and well, the different forms of growth. So it's a very elementary project, but I think it's important to think that we're not making one huge expensive building. We're actually not even making one that costs 2% of that, but we're actually being able to think of different small interventions that can change the life of many people. And they're thought to be resistant. You cannot break them, you cannot steal anything from them, because everything is built in with these cheap materials, and you can always see what's happening inside. So during the night, they can work as these lanterns, so obviously the space near them become also safer places. This is the common block. I don't know the name for it, but it's the regular block we used to build. It's just turned over, and it's really easy and cheap. So we're thinking with the help of the community building these units, we can actually reproduce this idea. And we're also thinking of Project 2 being a transportable unit, in this sense being possible to fund to make people know this project and fund the different models. So we'll finish just with a video of the cultural center. It was a video I just did last week, so you can understand better how the building actually works. Cultural Center. She is one of the most famous women writers. She was the wife of Octavio Paz. And the idea of having a place also where you can have other types of activities, not only books, but also small concerts, small theater presentations for kids, a garden, and seminars. So it's a place open to different activities in different sections of society. Every work is an excuse to work with somebody new, in this case Ariel Rojo or Arquitectura 911 or the landscape designers. For me, the collaboration is always the opportunity to find different answers to these same questions, and especially from outside Thank you very much.
Okay, while everyone's settling in, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. My name is Matt Ficus. I'm on the faculty here at the School of Architecture. And it's really a treat to be a part of this conference, even in a very small way. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Joshua Adlin. Joshua is a partner at Adlin Darling Design in San Francisco, and founded in 1998, the firm has received much acclaim, including the 2013 National Design Award, which honors lasting achievement in American design. Beyond that, Joshua's work really exhibits a high level of sophistication, both in terms of composition and in terms of craft. He was trained as an architect, but has also designed lines of furniture as well as one-off custom furniture pieces as well. And this is apparent in his design, which is rich in material tectonics, precisely because it's driven by inspiration from the body and the human experience. And ultimately, the work of Joshua Adlin is sustainable in a very noble sense of the word, and that it's really meant to last. And this is precisely due to the fact that the work balances structure and poetics. With that, I welcome Joshua Adlin.
We have an ability to actually impact our environment. I feel bad that everyone was looking straight ahead when they could have tilted their screen. Well, first of all, it's an incredible honor to be standing here presenting today. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Barbara, for inviting me. When I was first asked by Kevin, I did very little research, but a little research on the previous speakers from years past. And it was both intimidating and very rewarding to see that a number of iconic firms who were kind of our heroes, my partner and I, our heroes, had spoken ahead of me. And it's an incredible honor to follow in their footsteps, as well as speak alongside such incredible architects that have spoken this week. I think it would be helpful. A lot has been spoken about context, and I think it would be helpful to speak to the context in which my partner and I arrived at the firm we have today. So a couple years back, this was my partner and I. I'm on the left, my partner's on the right. I grew up in rural Ohio, in the Midwest. My father had originally started out in industrial design and then found his true passion in sculpture. My mother was a printmaker and a paper maker and a painter, a collage artist, and my older sister was a painter and a sculptor. I grew up surrounded by remarkable landscape, 15 acres of rolling hills, lakes, rivers, fields, and this had an incredible and indelible impact, I think, on who I am today and how I create. I ignored all that, and growing up, I rejected everything that I just spoke of and was focused on becoming a professional baseball player, much to my demise. But conversely, my partner grew up, and I think at the age of 2, determined he was going to be an architect, and not just an architect, but running his own firm, which was completely the opposite of me, and he grew up a family of engineers. So years later, we met at the University of Cincinnati, and upon graduation, we had these incredible kind of fantastic ideas of creating life-saving, life-changing architecture. But fast forward to kind of the reality of what we face in all the Americas, which is incredible friction to do almost anything meaningful and anything thoughtful and profound. And it's an incredible fight that we all have to undertake on a daily basis, but one that is well worth it. Fast forward to today, we have collected an incredibly talented team of architects. We're now 16 architects and designers within the studio. We feel as proud of the work we've done in the past number of years, equal if not more profound, to have created a collective of designers that is as talented and as committed to creating design excellence as we have. And it's, as anyone who has run a firm, you're only as good as the team that you've surrounded yourself with, and it's a remarkable team. The firm first started with Dave and myself, determined to create not an architecture firm, but to create a studio that would attack design on all fronts, from furniture design, interior design, landscape architecture, art, product design, a studio that would approach all different program types, all different scales, with the attempt of cross-pollinating all these various mediums, because they inform each one, they improve each one if you actually dive deep into each of these different mediums and scales. And I think it improves all of them by having that diversity. But not only that, we felt it was paramount that the study of these different mediums was done very physically. The heart and the soul of our practice is a wood and metal shop, where we're able to build and mock up almost at any scale. But the reality is trying to get all the designers in the studio to build at a one-to-one relationship with the buildings and the furniture that they're designing. And also explore and collaborate with as many fabricators and material suppliers and sculptors to truly understand the potential of non-repetition as far as, I mean, to be quite honest, the San Francisco, the Bay Area has the luxury of picking your material you want to work with and choosing who you want to work with on the design and fabrication side. And I realize that's a luxury, and it's one that we don't take for granted. But given that opportunity, we feel like it's critical to take advantage of it in a very meaningful way. So this study is very hands-on, and one that is not meant as a folly, but one that we feel is truly paramount to creating kind of honest and truthful design. So what you're looking at here is, believe it or not, kind of a proportioning tool that we use on all of our projects, where when you draw a half-inch rod in a SketchUp model or in a two-dimensional drawing, what does that feel like? What is the difference between that and 3/4 or 5/8? I mean, we're literally critiquing the studio down to a 1/16 of an inch. And it's a little obsessive, but proportion does not cost you anything. So if you're going to build, whether it's sheetrock or whether it's bronze, if you're going to build it, get it right. And if you're going to build it, understand what that proportion and that weight of a 3-inch by 10-foot by 2-foot slab of wood actually feels like, and what you're complementing that piece of wood with, if it's a piece of steel or whatever. Understand what the materiality and the proportion actually is. And what this has led us to in the last 10 years, I'd say, is a somewhat revised ethos of design, kind of rejecting the paramount concern, I think, in our culture today, which is visual. And understanding that if you actually design for all the senses, whether it's acoustic, whether it's tactile, whether it's olfactory, all of these, if they're taken into consideration, have a profound effect on every individual who engages your work, whether it's architecture or furniture or landscape. And it's just a matter of listening and watching and observing to implement it in a hopefully meaningful way. And so our studio is kind of a complete mess of, a palimpsest of materials that we're playing with on a daily basis. And again, the intent is to create a studio which is a non-vertical hierarchy, one which is very horizontal. And I think I see one of our ex-architects sitting in the audience, Eric Barth, and I think he can vouch for the fact that everyone in the studio is treated as a lead designer on every project, and they help on other projects, regardless of their age or experience level. So it truly is a democratic studio. It's not like Dave and I are dropping off little sketches on people's desks and saying, make this a reality. It's about acknowledging that every person who walks in that studio is a designer. They're an architect. Whether they're licensed or not, they're an architect. And that potential can only be realized if you give them room to breathe. So the project I'm going to focus on today is based in the South of Market area of San Francisco, which is predominantly a light industrial neighborhood for the past 50 or 60 years. But more recently, nightclubs have started to come in, residential housing has started to enter into the equation. So it's becoming a truly mixed community. And the owner, or the recent owner of this building, is a general contractor. And it's a general contractor that we'd had a number of successful projects with, and they could have picked any architect that they work with, but they picked us because of our collaborative spirit. And they, I mean, it's a pretty dismal environment, as you can see from the existing sky view. But the building itself is basically a basically a tin shed. And believe it or not, it was on the landmark historic registry of buildings, not for what it was, but for the adjacent brick structures which housed a historic brewery at the turn of the century. But the goal of the general contractor was to create a highly sustainable building, one of the, ideally the preeminent sustainable building in the city, to present to the community as not only an example of how to build, but that they can actually build it, and then to create a mixed-use building around it. So their offices were intended to be housed on the second floor. The third floor would be light industrial, and this sidecar space would be light industrial. And similar to the train of thought that has come out of a number of these lectures, what is the role of the architect? This was a unique case where we actually played co-developer. And unfortunately, we didn't get paid for this, but we basically took on the challenge of acknowledging what this building could be within the community, and we guided the building owner to transform it to reach its peak potential. So instead of housing more light industrial, we found that the zoning code allowed us to house professionals on the third floor. So there's an architecture studio on the third floor. And on this in the sidecar space and the adjacent front parking area, we suggested a restaurant. Now this completely broke all zoning codes because it didn't provide enough parking, it took away parking, but we were basically trying to encourage public transit in San Francisco while also deprivatizing this property. So how can you give back to the community? Well, we suggested to rip up the parking and replace it with a courtyard, and then create a transparent connection from the courtyard through a restaurant to a rear garden. Fortunately, the general contractor was game, and fortunately, our argument was compelling enough to the city that they fully embraced it. The side elevation is actually its most true historic elevation, and one that we took advantage of, as you'll see in a minute. The ground floor was a sea of wide flange steel columns with steel and concrete pan deck, which the unfortunate result was the column spacing was so small it was almost unrentable, and the height was almost too small to actually become meaningful for any real use other than light industrial. The second floor had a much more vaulted space. Here you can see heavy post and beam structure that had been painted. And given that the last use had been a plumbing warehouse, we had these kind of cubicles of offices within that we obviously planned to remove. So we had this dilemma where we're proposing a progressive new use to the building, but the planning department refused to allow us to change the front facade. They did not want us to add new fenestration, which is a bit tricky, because we were obviously adding office spaces that needed more light and air, more ventilation. So what we did, we could have easily proposed to just repeat these kind of historic large double hung windows and wrap it around the front. But we decided to attack it in a different manner. What we did is we said, listen, you've got 3 historic apertures, 1, 2, and 3. Let's embrace those and actually accentuate those with steel armatures that protrude past the building envelope. And then let's take these 3 apertures, which had been added in the 1960s, take their square footage and add them up and create a larger aperture. So you get this sculptural composition of these 4 apertures with no additional openings. I'll explain that in a minute. So this is a rendering showing each one of those apertures with the associated steel armature protruding, creating a much more dynamic front facade. And then when you treat them, you glaze each one of them. The restaurant, the primary entry, this is actually a translucent for a shower area, and then a larger aperture reconnecting the office space to the new proposed garden. But one of the tricks here is what you're seeing around it. So we had to replace the skin in kind. It had to be corrugated metal. So we proposed a zinc corrugation, but you're seeing a perforation introduced into the facade of diverging scale and then flipped in increasing scale. This was intended to basically solve 5 problems, but one of the keys was hiding the windows, the new windows that we needed to introduce behind it. And the pleasant result is one which allowed the historic post and beam structure below to kind of slowly reveal itself and create this kind of poetic dialogue between old and new. But it also reinforced a strong ethos within our studio of an almost impossible task, but one that we strive for on every project, where every move needs 4 or 5 reasons for being to validate its existence. And this is a great example where you have this perforated skin that provides light, it provides cross ventilation, it provides view, it provides a solar shade for the southwest corner, and lastly, it skins the building in a way that the planning department would allow it to be, or basically forced us to create to maintain the monolithic quality. And then diving in on the actual research involved in the manufacturing of it, because again, this was a general contractor. They did not want to spend a lot of money on their buildings. So we had to be extremely efficient with every gesture. So we created a pattern that repeats itself once on the ground, on the second floor, once on the third, and then flipped also onto the rear elevation. And we literally were potentially going to hand drill every one of these holes. And then we thought maybe we could laser cut them. But the end result, the most efficient and cost-effective result, was a collaboration with a milling company where they milled 4 deep, because we created a repeating pattern that allowed them to stack it 4 deep and cut the cost in a third. Had we not created this, we could never have afforded the skin. And then drilling deep, even on each panel, what seems as a very continuous graduation when you see it in built form is actually each one of these is divided in half. So you have size A on one side and size B, and then they just progressively get smaller or larger as they're stacked in plane. Inside, this was a great example of truly treating every one of your collaborators, your builders, your fabricators, your consultants, your client, as a designer, and not trying to be the smartest person in the room. This brilliant strategy, I would love to say, was my own or our project architects, but it was not at all. The concern that I brought up earlier about a low clearance and a sea of columns was actually solved when the structural engineer was wandering the site with the project super. And they realized they had a building that was extremely heavy, sitting on basically a bed of sand. So every time you dug, I don't know if you've ever tried to dig sand, it's extremely difficult, and it caused great fear for the contractor that they could not solve the structural problem because we're in a seismic zone. What they ended up doing is removing this really heavy second floor, which was concrete, and installing a very light lumber framed, TGI framed second floor, which raised the height, and then removed 95% of the columns and basically implemented helical piers, which dug into the sand and braced the perimeter, which is just a brilliant strategy. So here you see mid-construction, they preserved the exterior board form historic foundation, removed the columns, and are ready to begin framing the TJIs. But it brings up another point that we were talking about last night at dinner, and it was inspired by Federico's comments about the partie. And I think there's a misnomer that it makes sense to teach, and it makes sense on 90% of all projects, that the partie is the first thing you create and the design evolves from it. But I think in practice, oftentimes what's not discussed, because no one wants to acknowledge post-rationalization of their ideas, is that the partie can evolve through the design process. It's not something that happens necessarily as the first stroke. And this is a great example of it on this building. So the partie ended up being, we're preserving this block of existing foundation with the post and beam grid right above it. And then you layer transparent glazing on the ends, and then you layer a scrim, perforated scrim on the second, and then the tertiary layer are these steel armatures, which we then skewer back with a sculptural kind of a flip down element, which becomes a bridge and reconnects to the office. But that, and then on the north and south, completely preserved historic facades. Had we had that partie at the beginning of the project, there's no possible way that would have happened. So it's a lesson in kind of being patient and letting the ideas gel as they present themselves. So here's the final product. It's also, I think, a great example here again in the evening as the kind of collapsing of the old and new happen on the front facade. But I think it's a great example of one of my mentors who has an amazing furniture and art gallery in San Francisco based on incredible Japanese art. And he had critiqued one of my early pieces of furniture. And it was this painstakingly crafted mahogany and steel piece of furniture that was pin connected, no screws, no fasteners. And the reality was it was all highly, highly, highly polished in its refinement. And he said, it's a beautiful little piece. He said, but you're missing one of the key ingredients in all great works, which is you've swung your pendulum to one end, and you're missing the complementary rustic quality. And if you have both, then you have tension, and you have a very positive, profound tension between the pristine and the rustic. And it's something I'll never forget, because I think we can oftentimes obsess as architects on getting everything absolutely perfect, but it has the danger of becoming hermetic. So it was a lesson learned, and this, I think, is a good example of where you have this kind of really rusticated, beaten up, very kind of practically fabricated concrete foundation that was built, 80 years ago, and then this very kind of scrappy skin that we had installed but you complement that with these very pristinely proportioned vitrines that give you that, ideally give you that tension. And they become these very animated light boxes that begin to create a stage for the activities within. And then drilling down very quickly on this bridge element, where we basically kind of unfolded a portion of the armature that then rolled across the floor and became furniture as the reception desk. So these were the early sketches of these kind of folding planes and how the architecture and these kind of furniture-like elements can begin to pinwheel off each other and become both architecture and furniture simultaneously. So here you see this dialogue between the old foundation, this new conference room that was built out of the reclaimed lumber that had been demoed out of the building, and then the cross-section through to a bridge that pierces that front facade. And here you see the bridge then rolling out, becoming the floor, folding up and becoming the reception desk, and then a light fixture as well. And then inversely looking back from the reception area to the bridge. And the idea is that this precipice gives a general contractor that like this area to just get away from their desk and look out to the garden in the front. And at night. And then entering the conference room where you start to experience the perforations from the inside, providing a light air view, and then reclaiming the removed Doug fir beams for the conference room table. And then this is the architect's office. It's on the top floor. And again, I could not agree about counting points in the the kind of, in my view, the pathetic reality of that. But I think it really, one thing that I think is under communicated about architecture is our role as simple problem solvers, and that if you do very logically solve problems, you will create a very sustainable building. And you know, it only made sense to incorporate a living roof, solar panels, cross ventilation, reclaimed materials, pervious paving for rainfall. So it happens to be a LEED Gold shell. So again, upon our recommendation, the general contractor brought in a restaurateur who we were blessed with, Thad Vogler. He was one of the more renowned mixologists in the country, and he wanted his first venture to be a restaurant. And his goal, which was quite admirable, was to create a sustainable bar and restaurant that was very honest in its ingredients, from the spirits to the food that he foraged, but also honest in the expression of creating a venue which embraced the agricultural nature of where he sourced his materials, but it was being set in a very rusticated urban environment. So, how do you respond to that problem statement? And also one that was not like a temporary TI where it's going up one day and it's coming down 4 years later. But he really wanted this restaurant to be an iconic, historic landmark that people would come for the next 100 years. And how does that impact what you design and how you design it? So again, starting with the blank slate, we created a courtyard in front before we even had a restaurateur, so it was kind of a generic courtyard. And this was the space, incredibly generic space to start with. I mean, we had basically created a rat slab to keep the sand out, and we just had building paper, skylights, and some Z-walls to deal with. But how do you make a meaningful environment within that. And the way we approach, every one of our restaurants and almost all of our program types is by really diving in deep with our client and listening. And if you imagine the mixologist is going to be obsessed about liquids and how they're eaten and how they're served. And he very quickly, in one of our early meetings, he said, you realize that, and again, this is a higher end restaurant. I should start out by saying it's not an inexpensive restaurant, nor is it exotically expensive, but craft was key. And he said, 90% of restaurants, when you are served at your table, the liquids that you are served are compromised. A bartender at the bar is attending to all his patrons right around him, and he's trying to please them desperately. The beer is the perfect head, the cappuccino is the perfect foam, the tea is the perfect temperature, the cocktail has the perfect amount of ice, which is not melted. But the problem is the source for the rest of the restaurant, all the diners, is that same bar. So you're getting second shift, basically, second tier service. And so your liquids are just not very elegantly and appropriately presented. So he drove, that one comment drove the entire plan of the restaurant. So you had a public bar here and what he called the private bar here, which served the rest of the restaurant. So it was equally as elegant, equally as presentable, but no one was to walk up to it and gain service. Another obsession he had was the annoyance of tables moving, 2 tops turning into 4 tops, turning into 8 tops. He wanted, if he could, he would have bolted every table and chair down, because then the lighting is perfect. And so we compromised. We said, you'll go out of business if you do that, but we'll give you a whole bank to the south and to the north, adjacent the service island, permanent banquettes, and then kind of a sea of movable tables in the middle. And then what was key also, you had an existing aperture at the front and in the rear, and we created a ribbon that connected both of these, going over the restrooms, under the dining, up over the bar. And going backwards for a second, the circulation then 2 circulation paths down to a grotto for private dining, and then beyond is the actual kitchen. And then in section, given that the height of the space was some 16, 17 feet, we had to create a way to bring a more intimate scale to the banquettes. So we created what we call a wooden hull of reclaimed oak to lower the scale, and then these light cannons that drop down to provide natural light within the interior of the restaurant and responded to the existing skylights. And then just again in section, so here's your operable tables and then the grotto down below and the kitchen to your left. So this is an early rendering, again, depicting this reclaimed oak hull, the banquet seating, the private bar, the public bar, and the light cabinets. And then inversely, the same diagram with the addition of these suspended metal light fixtures. Here is it in its final state. And I should mention the reality of the financial dynamics. So halfway through design, and this is, as you can imagine, kind of in the downturn of the economy, half his funding disappeared. And the restaurant would not have been built had he not approached our firm and key fabricators and collaborators and said, would you basically invest your fee as part ownership in the restaurant? And we kind of looked at each other and said, well, we got to make it happen, so let's do it. So I now own a restaurant, and I've yet to see a penny. But what that did was it kind of like, rallied the troops into a very, very personal creation. where it was almost like anything goes. You'll go to the end of the earth to make it right because you might as well. So the key collaborators were the concrete Concrete Works, phenomenal prefab concrete. They did all the floors, these incredibly permanent board form die walls. They did all the concrete benches and all the concrete sinks. All the steel work was done by Chris French, and then these amazing sculptures coming down from the ceiling were Nicholas Weinstein. So we all teamed up and made it happen. I should also mention the amount of reclaimed material in this project. So all of the hull was made of reclaimed barn oak, as were the tables and the seats to the benches. The beautiful seats were designed by Sebastian Coe, who reclaimed all the wood from old wine barrel staves. And then the beauty of Thad is he would bring us these, just to mention, by the way, a lot of what you're going to see is very highly, highly textured architecture. And that doesn't come by accident. It's very intentional and very tried and mocked up and debated. And so it's intended to bring life, great life and character to these very permanent structures. But Thad would come to us at various points in the project and say, I've got this friend of mine who is X. You know, in this case, it was a taxi driver who created these beautiful photographs of this urban landscapes in San Francisco. And he said, can we make this integrated somehow into the architecture? So he gave us like 50 photographs. And we sat down and we edited and came up with this triptych that became the back wall to the bar, which we feel kind of makes the whole front entry experience quite vital. And then you can see just, you know, these don't happen by accident. This was an immense amount of dialogue back and forth with the concrete sub about the proportion, the amount of resawn, the amount of texture, how do you sculpt the step, how you how do you preserve in the bar these natural tenon holes from the tenons from the beams and fill them with resin, use them as handles. I mean, it became very utilitarian and hopefully very honest at the same time. But you get this dialogue between, you know, the artwork and the jewelry, the functional jewelry of the restaurant. And if you remember, the early sketches or renderings showed these banquettes as rectilinear steel frames with wood cladding. And the reality was they were just too expensive. And the concrete, you know, sub rose his hand. He's like, I can do something. And I've got this new material, ductile concrete, that's never been used in the States. What can we do? And so we started designing a way, and it's an amazing material. It's basically super high strength, dense concrete, which is filled with almost paper-like thin fiber that reinforces it. And you can create these amazing sinuous forms that are 1 inch thick. And this is our early study model. And it's originally it was formed, the form of the casting was done in styrofoam, but it started to literally blow out the formwork, and he couldn't keep it consistent. So then he subcontracted out laser cut steel forms, and you can create these highly precise. So you can see it here. They're pouring vertically down into the form, the concrete and the fiber reinforcing, and then they can grind and polish to absolutely perfectly smooth finish. We actually had them back off and leave air pockets to give it a little more organic quality. And it's a very simple tripartite diagram where you have an identical form marrying up and resting on a third form, which is kind of the bridge, and then bolted to the floor and pin connected at the top. And then we riffed on that for the maitre d' station. And this is also a great example of having to be fluid on your feet. We had worked with a supplier for these oak walls. You know, you're going to be getting these beautiful 2-inch by 8-foot long by 3/4-inch thick boards. You know, we didn't want it to be flimsy. We wanted it to be substantial. And we get a call from the general contractor. Well, your wood's arrived. I should mention, by the way, this entire process was design, build, parallel track. We were sketching while they were building. We were meeting on site, sketching details. They were building them live time, which is crazy given the complexity of some of these moves. But we wandered onto the site, and they had a stack of 1/4-inch boards that could not have been flimsier. And we were just like, oh, this is a disaster. And we basically started laying them out and creating different patterns. And a couple hours later, we came up with this kind of fish scale pattern that had to be assembled extremely quickly and easily. So it's basically 2 finishing nails, front and back, lap, and go. So I think it came out okay. And then just sculpting the concrete sinks through Rhino. That's the final product. And then collaborating, you know, what once had been these descending steel pendants, reality hit. We are obviously designing in seismic country. They would destroy themselves in an instant in an earthquake, so we ended up improving the design by attaching them to the wall, cabling back, and I think their dialogue with the light cannons looks like that. So again, an example of the owner in mid-process very tentatively approaching me and saying, I've got this friend who's a sculptor in glass. You know, would you be willing to work with him? And I said, well, so who are you talking to? And it turns out he's one of my best friends. And we've been trying to collaborate for years. And it's Nicholas Weinstein. And he does these phenomenal, like 300-foot long sculptures that dance and weave in the air. But he's only built in Asia, even though his production facility is in San Francisco. This is his first installation in the States. And it's a great example of backing off as an architect and not being prescriptive. We basically said, if you can fit within this rectangular form, do whatever you want, because I don't want to crush your creative process. And he originally actually came up with a very different design. It was with cylinders, but very cellular, incredibly powerful. I loved it. And then he said, oh my God, it's too heavy, it's too expensive, I need to redesign. So he redesigned, and he came up with these kind of billowing glass sculptures that I think are amazing. And they're just all fused together and wired together and hung from the ceiling. And this, you should go to his website only to understand how difficult this is to do, because he has to do this in a seismic zone. So he's working with Arup on this little, you know, scrappy little project to make sure that he doesn't kill everybody in an earthquake. But the amount of engineering and the amount of testing and just how they actually form this, it's very low tech in many ways, but it's brilliant. The end results of what he does. I highly recommend everyone checking him out. And the grotto space, again, paying reverence to the historic foundation. And another example, everyone was freaked out because we had this dining space that would, you know, look up women's dresses in the day or in the evening, and we're like, back off, just get it. It'll be fine. Everyone will be fine. What it's doing is it's bringing light down in from the main space into this dark grotto space. And it's also providing depth and layering from a lower area of dining to an upper area of dining. And they said, well, as long as we can frost them if it doesn't work. And it turned out everyone lived. The portals survived. And then the outside dining area at night, where the The idea was to create kind of a walled-in area of privacy, but more importantly, to create a place of discovery. So we made sure that there was these kind of apertures to peek in and see this live activity beyond in a very rustic industrial environment. And so there's very practically built exterior skin, which houses the address, lighting, and portals, playing background to the nature, skinning it with cedar on the inside, and then also housing the herbs in planters that then go into the organic cocktails that you drink. And again, it was LEED Platinum, but the more important thing is that it was just a great collaboration with local fabricators, with responsible reclaimed materials, in a very sustainable way. And here it is in full action. It's become a great watering hole for designers. Nothing else. Thank you very much.